Well, I moved to Dorset when I was about 7, and I've lived here on and off for most of my life. And my first ever job was as a reporter on the Dorset Echo. So I know the place pretty well, but I hadn't decided to write about it until this book. And in researching this book, it was kind of a lesson in not overlooking what's on your doorstep. Because even though I'd known things like people set off for the D-Day landings from Weymouth, which is just down the road from where I live, I'd sort of forgotten it. But as soon as I started looking into the period of time that my book covers in Dorset, I found there were all these amazing things that I could write about. And then it was also a chance for me to try and recreate what I love about this place. So the beach that the children, my characters, when we first meet them, are children, and the beach that they play on is basically a fictionalized beach that I used to play on. And so it was very lovely to try and recreate a place that is very dear to my heart, as well as uncovering all these really interesting bits of history that I had overlooked. When I first started thinking about writing about Dorset across a large span of time, I started thinking about writing about a country house, because there's a lot of them down here. And then and it's just a really useful sort of setting if you want to look at a cross section of society through a long period of time. But I knew that the country house is something that appears in a lot of books, a lot of TV series, that kind of thing. And I didn't want to just regurgitate what had already been done. So when I started thinking about the characters, I tried to think about people who wouldn't fit in to the house for whatever reason, whether that was because they were a sort of willful eldest girl, or a boy who didn't quite conform to the sort of typical hunting, shooting, fishing, traditional English gentleman, or that they were a second wife or a servant or whatever. So that was how I started thinking about them. They're going to be in this setting, but for whatever reason, then they're not going to feel entirely comfortable there. And that was kind of a way in for me into the setting. I think there is a sense, particularly with Christabel, because she is someone who has absorbed the ideas of tradition that she's found in the books in the library of the house, and through her reading, she's inherited these sort of very English patriarchal ideas of duty and tradition, and this is what we do, and this is how we do it. She is perhaps the one who finds it hardest to let go of those ideas and to find an alternate path through the world. I was actually, and it was interesting for me in terms of when I had a kind of idea of how the book was going to go when I set out. And I was thinking about the people who went out into the world in the war. I had an idea that I wanted to go into occupied France and explore what that was like for someone who became an undercover agent. It was all sort of very exciting, but I hadn't ever really thought about the people who stay at home. And it was actually that bit that was the most exciting for me. And I read lots of accounts of people who'd been land girls, and I read the sort of how women in that time ended up taking on the role of or some women in that time ended up taking the role of looking after a house, running a house, which perhaps they hadn't ever had the chance to do before. And for my character Flossie, whose trajectory through life would have been debutante, marriage, children, the war is like an opening up to her. She meets people she would never have met before. She gets to get her hands dirty because she joins the land army. She grows a vegetable garden. All of these things are things she would never have done. And that was really interesting. That was the most interesting bits for me. I came to writing, well, first of all, I wrote lots and lots of bad poetry, and then I wrote some short stories, and my short stories were set in the past, in the present, and in the future. So I've jumped around. I have always enjoyed reading historical fiction, particularly those ones that it's almost like time travel, where when you read them, you feel like you're absolutely in this place. So there's not that rose-tinted, nostalgic looking backwards view. It's you're right in it, and it's very vivid. I think that historical fiction at its best does that. If you think about Wolf Hall, you're right in the Tudor court at that time, and it makes what you might think of as predetermined history seem uncertain all over again, even though we know, most people know what happens to Thomas Cromwell. you're still completely engaged in those books because it makes it feel so alive. Um, and I've always enjoyed those books. And when I came to thinking about writing my own novel, the idea of tracing a group of people across a span of time was really attractive to me. And the first half of the 20th century is one that I read about for fun. I read a lot of social and cultural history books, and that period of time, the 20s, 30s, 40s, is just fascinating to me. It's sort of history within touching distance, really. My parents were born just before the war and during the war, so it's not that far away. And there's still traces of it, and it looms so large in our cultural imagination. I think that period of time is part of our national story, so it's really interesting to go back and try and find out what life was like then.
Yeah.
It's probably as close as I can get to being in an actual time machine. But yeah, and I think it's so exciting at the moment, historical fiction as well, because it does all sorts of things. You can have the kind of traditional saga-y family saga thing, but there's also those books that are taking stories that you think you know and then telling them a new way, like Pat Barker's Trojan War novels, where we think we know the story of the Iliad, but we completely overlooked the story of the women in that time. And so there's always exciting possibilities and always new stories that can be told, I think.